before everything started falling apart, I swore I would never go near the barn again. That was 3 weeks ago. Now I realize vows like that are just clumsy attempts to hide the fear. I live in a house at the edge of the woods, one I inherited from my grandfather. Broken tile roof, windows that groan when the wind remembers names. At first I told myself solitude had sharpened me to ordinary sounds. The whisper of branches, the brush of a small animal in the undergrowth, the dull thump of a limb against the window at 3 in the morning. After the first night, I found those small, elongated prints pressed into the mud of the path leading to the barn. I knew this was different. They weren't dog prints, not deer. There was a rounded pad like a paw and then an extended mark, like a hand clutching the earth. The first time I saw it felt like seeing a factory mistake in the dark. A silhouette too tall, ears hanging like rags, a wrinkled face that didn't fit any animal. It stayed far enough away that my throat locked before my brain could decide what to think. It didn't speak. Its mouth was a hollow when it parted its lips, and from that hollow came no words, only a wet old sound, like a throat clearing from another century. The timber under my feet shivered, as if the whole barn had taken a breath. I barely breathed. At first, I told myself I was hallucinating, lack of sleep, the cheap beer I drank to silence the nerves, but the marks on the door didn't vanish. A ring of soil, a trail of scratches. Something had tried to get in and had withdrawn its hand in a patient way, like someone taking notes. The night I found a scrap of fabric hung from a beam, matted with hair and carrying a smell I couldn't place. Not animal, not human. I understood I wasn't just losing my composure. Someone, or something, was mapping my house. The air began to change at dusk, a mix of rotten grass, old metal, and a sweetness that coated my teeth. At night, when the lights go out and ordinary sounds sink away, I clutch my mug of hot tea and listen to something scrape, delicate, along the barn door's wood. It isn't like a mouse. It's deliberate, like someone tracing a name letter by letter. It's strange to admit now, but the place I was most afraid was not outside. It was in my own bed, when the ceiling seemed to breathe in time with me. There's a pattern to those sounds. Steps that start slow, then quicken, and then silence. A silence that sticks to your tongue and roughens your voice when you try to call someone. And the last night before everything blew into pieces, I found something hanging from the doorknob. A small scrap of skin, dry, with tangled gray fur. It bore a mark, like a symbol carved with claws. I didn't say anything. I sat in the kitchen until dawn stole whatever courage I had left, and for the first time, I saw myself looking at the barn as if inside it were not just tools, but a secret with an appetite. After that morning, I started sleeping with the kitchen light on. It felt ridiculous, childish even. But when you found a scrap of skin on your doorknob, ridiculousness becomes a kind of strategy. For a few nights, the scraping continued, patient and precise, and each morning there was another subtle sign. A smear of dirt on the windowsill, a tuft of fur tucked into the hinge of the pantry door, a single shallow groove carved into the wooden frame of the mirror. The groove had the shape of an ear. I stopped laughing at myself. The thing began to learn the rhythm of my life. It didn't burst in. It studied me, imitated the unremarkable moments. The way I clicked the kettle, the cadence of my keys when I locked the front door, the soft exhale I made before picking up the phone. Once I woke to the sound of my own voice chanting nonsense from the hallway. My voice, but slowed, as if someone had dragged a gramophone across the floor. I remember sitting bolt upright in bed, listening to that altered version of myself repeat a childhood rhyme I hadn't thought of in years. The house answered. The walls seemed to bend toward the sound, and in that bend, the light over the sink dimmed, as though someone had sucked the filament into their mouth. Neighbors started mentioning odd things. Mrs. Calloway from 2 houses down asked if I'd seen her cat. She said it had been sulking by the barn for a week and then vanished. The delivery driver who brought my groceries tapped at my window and refused to step onto my porch. He said, "There's something wrong," without looking me in the eye. They weren't blaming me, but in the way people step around a broken object, they were careful of me. They assumed proximity meant contamination. I could feel the suspicion like a new kind of weather pressing on my skin. One night I opened the barn to see if I could find a pattern, to prove to myself there was a rational cause. The smell hit me first. Copper and wet wool and something older, like bones steeped in rain. The beam where the creature had hung things was decorated now. Strips of fabric, a child's mitten, a rusted tin whistle. Each object had a tiny bite taken from it. On the floor, arranged in a loose spiral, were clods of earth, like a crude map. In the center of that map sat a small, cracked photograph propped against a stone. My grandfather. He was smiling in the picture, young and stubborn, holding a rabbit by the ears. Someone had cut his face out of the photograph and glued it with rough edges onto a different mouth, one that looked wet and too wide. I should have walked away. I should have set it all on fire and called someone with authority. Instead, I picked up the photograph. The paper was warm. That heat crawled up my fingers like a live animal. When I looked down, the air between me and the photograph trembled, and for a moment the barn smelled like my childhood kitchen. Spices on the counter, lemon oil, my grandfather's aftershave. It was absurd, comfort blooming in the same breath as rot. After that night, the creature grew bolder. It stopped hiding outside in the shadows and began appearing where I had thought of it least, caught in the reflection of my coffee, framed in the crack between the cellar door and the floorboards, briefly visible in the smear of condensation on my bathroom mirror. Once, standing at the sink, I saw it so clearly that my own face froze with recognition. A human jaw, too many wrinkles, and ears like pendants that fell limp against the cheekbones. It mouthed my name. The sound didn't come from its lips. It seemed to be shaped out of the silence itself and projected into my skull. I tried to fight back. I nailed the barn door shut, hammered planks across the windows, spilled salt in a ring around the threshold like some joke pulled from an old movie. The salt scattered when I returned the next morning. The circle had been stepped over without disturbing the grains. That was the moment I stopped assuming I would survive this on my own terms. I started to notice other changes, small at first, then impossible to ignore. My reflection sometimes lagged a breath behind me, as if some part of me walked through molasses. I would find tufts of gray fur clinging to my sleeve after I'd been alone in the house for hours. Once, in bed, I felt the slow, patient movement of something running along my jawline, like a tongue tasting the bone. Something had mapped my life, and now it was rewriting geography. The barn was no longer a place I could inspect. It had become a mouth around which the rest of the world arranged itself. I began to hear the rhythm of it at night. At first just the scrape, then an underlying beat, like a second heartbeat that matched my own. The sound burrowed under my ribs and taught my pulse to follow. On the last night before everything changed permanently, I woke to find someone sitting at the end of my bed. Not in the way a trespasser sits. There was no chair, no weight on the mattress, just presence. It smelled of dust and clover and something sharp. It touched my foot with a fingertip that was calloused and damp. I closed my eyes because I did not want to see what it had learned to mimic. In the dark, a voice whispered, soft as cotton, "You remember the promise." When it whispered, "You remember the promise," something in me folded the way old maps fold into themselves, neat creases that hide the path. The words were not an accusation so much as a summons. I had made a promise once, in a kitchen warmed by my grandfather's humming, when I was small and brave in the wrong kind of way. I had promised to look after the place he left behind. I had promised to keep a secret I did not understand. I thought the promise would keep me safe. I had not known how promises can become doors. That night I rose, not because I trusted my feet, but because the house had become a kind of clock I could not ignore. The air was thick with the taste of iron and old mint. My mouth filled with the memory of the photograph, the warmth in my fingers as if something beneath the paper had still been alive. The house seemed to open for me in slow, deliberate motions. Doors eased with a breath, the floorboards shifted like slow speech. I wrapped a jacket around me, though the weather was mild. It felt like armor against something that preferred the skin. The barn door resisted at first, but I had learned the grain and the knot of the latch. When it finally gave, the darkness inside was not a lack of light, but a presence, a density that swallowed the beam from my flashlight and answered with its own dim, internal glow. It was the kind of dark that smells, of soil, old rope, and the metallic tang that comes from fingernails scraping bone. Shapes hung from rafters like slow-moving emblems. Toys with teeth, gloves filled with straw, photographs pinned with nails. Each object vibrated faintly, as if remembering a name. I should have turned and run then. Instead, I stepped deeper, and the barn closed around me like a mouth. The spiral of earth I'd seen earlier had grown. Now it threaded across the floor with lines cut into the wood like veins. In the center, on a flat rock, lay a stack of photographs. I knelt, hands trembling, and as I lifted the top one, my breath fogged the image, another picture of my grandfather holding the rabbit. But his face was wrong. The eyes were not his. They were black and wet, and the mouth had been extended with cut paper until it matched the grin in the creature's face. Beneath the stack, something moved. It emerged slow as a story being told. Up close, it was a puzzle of human and animal parts, assembled by a mind that loved asymmetry. The skin was papery, the ears folded into themselves like old maps. The mouth, it had been the mouth in the altered photograph, yawned open and closed, showing teeth that were too many and too small, like pebbles glued to gum. It smelled of lemon oil and rot. The scent tricked me into remembering my grandfather's hand on my head, and for a moment, the ache inside me ate away the fear. "You kept the promise," it said, and this time the voice was not in my head, but in my mouth. Or perhaps my mouth was in its voice. The sensation was like having a radio turned on inside my skull, a low tuning that matched the beat I had felt under my ribs. I tasted the words as they formed, copper and paper, and the faint sweetness of old bread. I tried to speak, and my voice came out wrong, hollow at first, then layered, as if two people were speaking from the same throat. "What do you want?" I managed, though I already knew. It wanted the shape of my life. It wanted the map it had been building to be complete. Around us, the hung objects shifted. The mittens twitched like sleeping animals. The strips of fabric coiled toward me like hands. I felt the floor lean. The barn itself seemed to tilt to observe. Then it reached for me, not with a single hand, but with a long, patient interest. Its fingers were calloused in the way a farmer's are, the ridges of knuckles familiar from years of work, and in that familiarity there was a cruelty. It used my own memory against me. There was no fight I could summon that night that mattered. I tried to run, but each step dragged like wading through cold honey. My arms felt heavier with every motion. It touched my face, and as its fingertip traveled along my jaw, a tiny spark leapt, like static at a window, and something in me rearranged. Memories rearranged too. Afternoons folded into the smell of hay. Lullabies became chants. The photograph in my hands warmed and then soaked my palm with a thin, sticky wetness that I could not identify. When the change began, it was not cinematic. There was no blinding light, no triumphant roar. It happened in small betrayals, a twitch behind the ears, a soreness in the jaw like a tooth being pushed through, the slow thickening of the voice when I hummed. My reflection in a puddle looked back with an unfamiliar patience, like someone watching through a mask. Most disturbing of all, when I tried to scream, the sound that came was layered with something else. An old sound I had once heard beyond childhood, a wet, satisfied noise. I think that was the bargain, a life in exchange for a promise kept. The creature wanted continuity, the lineage of a household that had owned it long enough to teach it how to be human at the edges. It wanted a face that would come when called. The thing that had been my grandfather's photograph had wanted a mouth, and it had found one willing. I write this now with hands that shake but are steady enough to leave ink. The barn is quiet in the way a grave becomes quiet, settled, patient. Outside the windows, the night breathes its normal noises, unaware or uninterested. I don't know if anyone will read these pages. I don't know if the neighbors will talk about the man who kept his promise or about the man who didn't. I can feel the slow, careful learning inside me. The way it traces a name, the way it keeps a map. Sometimes, in the mirror, I catch myself smiling a little later than I should. I close this with the only truth I have left, and the last clear thing my human mouth can shape before the other voice settles to a hum. It is waiting.
Subscribe to Horror Story Bar.